Hello again, dear ones. This is part B of a broad, brief sketch of American hymnody in the 19th century as it relates to the development of the classic American hymn style of the late 19th century, which I am calling Pious American Minimalism. Part A was a kind of preface, introducing some ideas about how the music of this period has been misunderstood. This part will look at some of the figures involved. Let's begin by orienting ourselves in the early 19th century and listen to the sound of the early Romantic period. That tune, which is in over 600 hymn books, as a hymn tune is called Canonbury. It is borrowed from Robert Schumann and was written by him in the 1830s, originally as an etude, a practice piece for amateurs. It's a lovely tune, and I've included it because it's quite representative of European music at this time, so I'll use it as a reference track when looking at some of the other compositions that are featured. As mentioned in Part A, my discussion of this period is centered around a debate, albeit a minor debate, in music history. The claim has been made that there was a kind of conflict or tension between hymn composers in the late 18th century who were supposedly trying to create an exclusively American hymn music style and their later detractors, particularly the excellent hymn tune composer and educator Lowell Mason and his friend and associate Thomas Hastings. I saw this theory attributed to 20th century theorists like George Pullen Jackson and Gilbert Chase. It doesn't seem to have been a major thesis for either of these historians, but among minor voices it's like a legend that has grown in the telling. The theory goes that there was a homegrown hymn style in the late 18th century in the works of a group of composers sometimes referred to as the Connecticut School, and that this noble endeavor was undermined and overthrown. I've even seen it described as censored by their enemies who preferred European music, and are sometimes described as the better music movement, the main figures of which were the hymn tune writers Lowell Mason and Thomas Hastings, but might also have included other figures who knew them or worked or studied with them, such as William Bradbury, another important hymn tune composer. Presented in such stark and exaggerated terms, it's a fanciful theory, but it does reflect some attitudes that were genuinely held. I was fascinated when I first heard of it, and it's a useful thread upon which to connect a brief overview of a small selection of the music of the late 18th and early 19th century. The American tradition of the Connecticut School, described in the legend, centers around a group of musicians and composers, primarily William Billings, Daniel Reed, Supply Belcher, and some others. One of the lesser-known figures of this group, whose music really jumped out at me, is composer Timothy Swan. I'd like to play one of Swan's tunes and look at some of William Billings' writing. I'll also play one of Lowell Mason's tunes from early in the century and look at a few passages from his and of Thomas Hastings' writing. Both these contending schools were located in the Northeast USA. Lowell Mason and Thomas Hastings were from Boston, Massachusetts, one of the 6 small US states in the Northeast referred to as New England, and the Connecticut School, while not all from Connecticut, were all also from New England. I'll also play an interesting tune and song from elsewhere in the USA during this period by William Walker. Then we'll look at 2 tunes from the end of this period that to me encapsulate the new American minimalism, which is a product of these different contending musical schools. Even such a brief overview is a lot to cover. A lot of music for me in one episode, but I think it's an amazing period. There's a vast amount of beautiful hymnody, both poetry and music in this period, so it's impossible to go into much detail, but I wanted to present a mere hint of the variety of music. So the debate, the legend, such as it is just a vehicle to present a very quick overview. American hymnody doesn't begin in the late 18th century, but I shall begin then, the period of the so-called Connecticut School. Here is a charming hymn tune by Timothy Swan. That's Poland by Timothy Swan. I first heard this sung by Anonymous 4 on their excellent album American Angels. It has a lovely transparent sound. The chords are simple but purposeful. Every chord has a deliberate expressive function. The voicings have a lot of space, sometimes just the tonic and the fifth. It's in C-sharp minor, so it's mostly minor chords, and the melody moves through the voices. Soprano, alto, bass, and here and there the tenor takes it. It sounds lovely when sung. We'll hear from Thomas Hastings shortly, but one thing he said summarizes the artistic aims of most of these composers. He describes the ideal hymn music as being chaste and simple. Poland by Timothy Swan has that quality. Sad and dignified, published in Swan's book New England Harmony, published in 1801 and available on archive.org. For the Isaac Watts text, God of my life, look gently down. I'd describe it as having something of a Baroque sound, not the Baroque of Handel and Bach, but similar to the lovely free songwriting style of William Knapp that we looked at in the last episode. Here's the tune on page 59 of his book. It's 18th century typesetting, not as sophisticated as hymn books would become, but there's 100 pages of music in this book, all by Swan himself. He's done very well. This is his lifetime's work, which he probably paid for himself, as there is no reference in it to subscribers or patrons. It's an important document. There are other similarities with William Knapp. They were both gifted amateur composers who were also tradesmen. While William Knapp was a glover, Timothy Swan was a hatter. Timothy Swan is just one example of the Connecticut School, but they're all essentially naive composers in the sense of being isolated from the mainstream of music, but gifted, with some lovely material, albeit not consistent. Like other members of the Connecticut School, there's a section at the start of Timothy Swan's book about how to read music. But instead of looking at that, let's jump to William Billings' book. Billings was also a tradesman, a tanner. He was also self-educated, and as we will see, well self-educated. And, as noted, as well as sharing music to praise God, there was a strong educative purpose to his hymn book. I'll look at Billings the composer another time, but the education section of his hymn book is very interesting. He describes a little about the science of sound. There will be continual condensation and expansion of the air at every complete vibration of the chord, whence it will appear evident that there must be the same number of tremors or vibrations of the air that the sonorous body makes. These reciprocal tremors of the air, made by the vibrations of an elastic body, succeed each other in an undulatory or wave-like manner, analogous to waves generated in the surface of stagnant water by an impressed force, and spread themselves around in every direction, in concentric spheres. The nature of sound had been understood for 100 years or so, but this is still a good explanation. He also describes the biology of the ear. Interestingly, he gives a very accurate description of the ratios behind harmonies in what is called just intonation, something I'm personally very interested in. The next most perfect concord is what is called the octave. In two musical chords or strings, the one which yields a tone an octave more acute than the other, it performs double the number of vibrations. Hence, unison and octave, by reason of their near resemblance, have been mistaken for one and the same sound. When the times of the vibrations of two musical chords are as 2 to 3, the coincidence will be at every third vibration of the quickest, which is therefore in the next degree of perfection and called a fifth. So he means the fifth has a ratio of 3 to 2. If the times of the vibrations are as 3 to 4, the coincidence will be at every fourth of the lesser, and this is called a fourth. But this and the next two which follow, in order, viz. 4 to 5 and 5 to 6, which makes the third greater and the third lesser, so the major and minor third, are not so pleasant or agreeable to the judicious ear, and are therefore called imperfect concords. There does not appear any natural aptitude in the two sounds of a concord to give a pleasing sensation more than two of a discord. This must be resolved into the divine will, which is thought proper to impress us with pleasing or displeasing perceptions. So the ability to distinguish harmony, he's saying, the ability to distinguish harmony from dissonance is a gift from God. We know what is pleasing, though we do not know why. So he describes the ratio of sounds accurately and quite clearly, given that it's a difficult subject. Knowledge of why certain intervals sound harmonious goes back to Pythagoras, and it was perfected in the Renaissance, so it isn't new. But for some reason, this has never been common knowledge, even among musicians. I'd like to do an episode on this topic because there's a lot to it. So he talks about singing, and he has a sol-fa diagram, the notes and the staves. Not sure what the numbers mean here. He has keys and scales. He lays out keys and scales, although for a beginner these would be quite hard to understand. There are descriptions and glossaries, altogether a lot of educational material. Here's the scale, which he calls the gamut, then his hymn tunes. I'll look at this group of composers more closely another time, but I wanted to show the high degree to which Billings saw himself as an educator, as did all the composers of this time. Now we get to the antagonists, the baddies in our little fable, Lowell Mason and Thomas Hastings. These two are supposed to have prevented the development of a uniquely American hymn style, a work begun by the Yankee tunesmiths of the Connecticut School, due to their having ruined American hymnody by introducing European musical ideas. This is a fable, of course, but it is true that Mason and Hastings loved and promoted European music. Let's listen to an early piece of Lowell Mason and compare it to our reference tune by Robert Schumann. That's an early Lowell Mason tune called Hamburg. In Hamburg, you get a strong hint of European Romanticism, which was very new at this point. So for Lowell Mason at least, his European influences were very current. Ironically, early Romanticism already had much in common with ideas in American hymnody. The Romantic composers embraced regional and ethnic musical styles, think of Chopin and Dvorak, and especially in the early Romantic period, many composers were moving towards simpler pieces, full of emotion. Lowell Mason's most famous hymn tune is Bethany, the tune usually paired with the hymn text, Nearer My God to Thee, although that's a later tune. He also saw himself very much as an educator. To get an idea of this, let's look at a hymn book he edited and published. This is the Boston Handel and Haydn Society collection of church music, published in 1832. There are no criticisms in it of existing church music. He just expresses a desire to expand the music available, which he does. It contains 15 pages of teaching, a one-page glossary, 1 page of exercises, that's 17 pages, and 332 pages of music. It's nicely typeset, but not yet in the grand staves. It's in separate lines. The most fun part of this book is the very good music theory section at the start. Lowell Mason covers all the basics extremely well. If you wanted a primer on how to read music, this is a really good one. You would quickly know enough to read and understand music, and it's presented as a quiz. Lesson 1 of the staff. What is a staff? A staff is 5 lines with their intermediate spaces. What is the use of a staff? Most of the musical characters are written upon it. Lesson 2 of notes. How many kinds of notes are there? 6. What are they called? Semibreve, minim, crotchet quaver, semiquaver, and demi-semiquaver. Lesson 6 of time. How many kinds of time are there? 3. What are they called? Common, triple, and compound. Lesson 8 on the diatonic scale. What is the order of intervals in the diatonic scale major mode? From the 3rd to the 4th sounds, mi to fa, and from the 7th to the 8th sounds, si to do, are semitones. The rest are whole tones. What is the relative minor to any major key? It's the 6th above or the 3rd below. Great quiz. You can imagine members of the family entertaining each other in the evenings with it. If we look at the tunes in the book, it contains figured bass. We've talked about figured bass before, including in the last episode, and it's typeset in 4 staves, so it's written for a choir. But for an instrumentalist, you would use the bass and the figured bass. This is exactly how accompanists in Handel's time would have read music. There are a lot of tunes, but it's an early book. Composers are not named with the tune. The names of the tunes differ from later hymn books, since Lowell Mason is putting some of these tunes in a hymn book for the first time, and there is no composer index, so I'll have to explore it over time. But some of the tunes jumped right out at me. It has New Sabbath by the wonderful Isaac Smith. We looked at him in the Cooper episode, a British composer, but I haven't found this tune in a British hymn book. And also Nottingham by Isaac Smith. There's Wyndham by Daniel Reed, one of the Connecticut School. There's hundreds of tunes, including wonderful old hymns, new tunes adapted by Lowell Mason, some Connecticut School tunes. There's some Thomas Tallis, some Gregorian chant themes, a Purcell piece on page 129, although I don't recognize it. And Purcell is one of those composers who is sometimes falsely attributed to a tune for some reason. There's some Handel. There's the great tune Helmsley, although the arrangement is a bit different from the one we would recognize. It doesn't have texts. It's a tune book. And there were plenty of books of hymn texts or poems, as typesetting text was much cheaper than typesetting music. It's organized by meters and has a metrical index. Can you imagine, in the early 19th century, a young musician or singing group in a small town in America receiving this? What an exciting book. I'm excited just browsing it. It must have been life-changing for its readers. It opens a whole world. I'll be exploring it for years. There's so much lovely hymn music out there from our glorious past. As an educator, Lowell Mason is continuing a vital mission begun by the composers and poets that he has been portrayed as an enemy of. But now let's talk about Thomas Hastings. Thomas Hastings is probably most famous today for having written the tune Top Lady, which is the tune usually used for the hymn Rock of Ages Cleft for Me. But in our little fable of how the bad Europeanists suppressed the musical genius of the native-born Americans, he is the other villain. Is that fair? We can test the claim by looking at Hastings' very interesting book, A Dissertation on Musical Taste. In this book, it's true that he does directly criticize the writers and composers of the Connecticut School in several places. He generally refers to them indirectly, but it's clear to whom he's referring. His harshest comment is way down on page 203 and 4. Our country has given birth to a multiplicity of ephemeral productions that fall infinitely beneath criticism, but there are several points respecting them that are not unworthy of our notice. Ouch! The rude attempts at fugue and imitation that are discoverable in our ephemeral productions exhibit at once the operations of a vitiated taste and the necessity of some degree of variety in our style of designing. He uses the word vitiated in numerous places in the book. In modern English, we would say degraded. So he calls them ephemeral, meaning brief and insignificant. He says they are unworthy even of criticism, and he criticizes attempts at fugue and imitation. In modern musicology, the word fugue, like J.S. Bach's fugues, means something quite specific with lots of rules. And if you don't know, a fugue is a piece where the voices come in a staggered way, repeating the same or a similar line of music. The simplest music of this sort is a round. In academic terms, a round is not a fugue. And the term fugue isn't used to describe Renaissance polyphony, even though it's a very similar form of music. The academic term for the same or similar lines of music that enter separately and overlap is imitation. It's a terrible, nondescriptive, bland term, but that's what it's called. Another important term to know is subject, when a new voice enters in a fugue or in polyphony out of sync with the other voices, which is the whole point. Perhaps the same, perhaps played faster or slower, transposed or altered. That line in the music is called a subject. Anyway, in the 18th century Connecticut School, they liked writing in a sort of simple polyphony, like a round, but with some variation between the subjects. But fairly simple, although probably very enjoyable to sing. The Connecticut School composers who used this technique called it fuguing, spelt F-U-G-E. So Thomas Hastings criticizes rude attempts, meaning unsophisticated attempts, at fugue and imitation. And this is what he's referring to. And elsewhere, on page 103, so earlier in the book, while on the topic of imitation, that is polyphonic techniques, he says, "Who has been doomed to listen to those senseless productions which formerly found their way into our American churches, and can doubt of their misapplication in the inferior compositions of our own country?" My goodness, that is very harsh. Except that this is in a passage where he's criticizing polyphony generally, not just by the Connecticut School. So what he calls two species of imitation, and Thomas Hastings really doesn't like polyphony. Let's jump forward a few pages to page 105, where he describes the music of the great composers of the Renaissance who invented polyphony. However, before we go any further, let's put this into context. The 18th and 19th centuries were the age of satire. Thomas Hastings is writing in the period between Jonathan Swift and Mark Twain, and he's writing very soon after Jane Austen. So I think we need to recognize that this exaggerated criticism may be meant to be read as at least partly humorous. So for the next few quotes, I'm going to put them into a very weak approximation of a Mark Twain type accent, not for the sake of the accent, but to convey the idea that this could be satire. Talking about Renaissance polyphony and great composers like Palestrina and Thomas Tallis, he says, "The exercise of ingenuity and the conquering of difficulties in constructing these complicated pieces could render them sufficiently interesting to their fabricators, we may suppose, but what connection had these circumstances with the public ear? Could any person be benefited with listening when 20 or 30 individuals were disputing on 4 or 5 different subjects at the same time? Fortunately for the composer, however, the words being in Latin were not the least consequence to the generality of listeners." So what he means is fitting together all these subjects for polyphonic musical lines was so difficult. It might have been difficult to the Renaissance composers, but the only thing that saved the public when they're listening to 20 or 30 individuals disputing 4 or 5 different subjects was that they were all sung in Latin, and no one could have understood it anyway. I love the Renaissance polyphonists, but that is kind of witty. And speaking of the Baroque fashion for musical ornamentation, he writes, "In relation to trills, slides, turns, springs, flourishes, variations, ad libitum, cadenzas, and the whole class of superficial embellishments of a song, that, though the vocalist must necessarily have some reference to public taste, he should rather study chasteness than profusion." Here. And here he talks about dissonance in music. "The composer may produce a long succession of scientific discords that are pleasing to his own ear, and call it, if he chooses, an earthquake, a whirlwind, or the representation of chaos. But after a gaping auditory," he means a stunned audience, "have submitted to listen to with blind approbation," that's approval, "for a few successive performances, their feelings, in spite of all the veneration for a celebrated author, will revolt at that which has to them all the appearance of unmeaning jargon." This criticism is made sharper by the fact that jargon at this time meant the unintelligible slang used by criminals. So the overuse of discords is like listening to the meaningless slang of criminals. Actually, I find this unfair. If it were directed at some of the music from the 20th century onwards, where dissonance was carried to great extremes, it is quite witty, and I would share that view. But the music of the early 19th century contains very little strong dissonance, and the dissonances that the composers were experimenting with were often quite beautiful. Anyway, it's a matter of taste, and there's a lot that Thomas Hastings doesn't like. And here, Thomas Hastings, member of the Handel and Haydn Society, talks about George Frederick Handel himself. "He spoke English too imperfectly to admit of his always doing justice to the words of vocal music, yet he is represented by one of his biographers as having been uniformly indignant at every friendly suggestion in relation to the circumstance. On one occasion, he went so far as to insist that his music was good, and to challenge his advisers to set appropriate poetry to it." And of Haydn, in particular Haydn's sacred music, he says, "He often paints the seductive charms of sin instead of the penitence of the sinner." So Thomas Hastings does criticize the music of the USA up to that time, but he criticizes a lot of other things as well. And it's possible to read too much into comments that are very likely intended to be the kind of harsh but humorous satire that was extremely common at the time. He does also write seriously, and his main points are quite well made and express an aesthetic philosophy widespread at the time. He notes that church music especially should be expressive in its effects, that without expression it loses the most essential of its peculiar requisites, that like the eloquence of the pulpit, it should be sufficiently chaste and simple, to be relished and understood by every portion of listeners. And on page 19, here is a good quote from the 18th century English composer Avicen, which says something very similar. The power of music is, in this respect, parallel to the power of eloquence. If it works at all, it must work in a secret and unsuspected manner. In either case, a pompous display of art will destroy its own intentions, on which account one of the best general rules, perhaps, that can be given for musical expression is that which gives rise to the pathetic in every other art, an unaffected strain of nature and simplicity. Nature meaning things that are natural, like the natural harmonies we looked at in other episodes, and pathetic as in having pathos, making us feel emotion towards others, related to the word empathy. And here is some advice for musicians, composers, choir directors, and so on. But if it is the musician's business to gratify his listeners, as well as to refine their taste, he cannot expect to control them at his pleasure. The musician must take the public as he finds them, and endeavour to render them as they should be, by the gradual dissemination of taste. And finally, near the end of the dissertation, in modern psalmody, the public taste requires plain harmony and chaste, simple, and energetic melody. You may disagree, but he sums up the feelings of a great many people writing church music at this time. So yes, Lowell Mason and Thomas Hastings were Europeanists. And yes, Thomas Hastings criticized earlier American composers. Thomas Hastings criticized uneducated music in general, and even some of the great composers. They were educators, which is a good thing. Thomas Hastings is quite funny in places. We've heard a lot about the Northeast, because the composers of the Connecticut School, represented here by a single tune from Timothy Swan, and Lowell Mason and Thomas Hastings all came from the Northeast. Commentators at the time tend to talk about the rest of the USA as the South. But since the rest of the USA doesn't actually correspond with the South, as it is understood was reference to the 19th century, and because that term has many connotations related to slavery and the Civil War, I'm going to refer to the rest of the USA as the hinterland. The hinterland was also full of educators. Everyone these days was trying to get you to learn about music, sing in a choir, and learn to read music. You really should learn to read music. Hymn book publishing and music education proceeded apace in the hinterland. Daniel Bailey notes, most hymn publishing, which was huge and greatly exceeded non-religious music publishing, occurred in the countryside and small towns. To represent this hinterland, the rest of what was mostly rural and small town USA, I'd like to play a tune by William Walker. So we're in the middle of the Second Great Awakening, a nationwide religious revival, a time of large Christian gatherings known as camp meetings. William Walker was a composer, writer, arranger, and music educator who taught singing by the shape note method. We'll talk about that another time. I played a very interesting and original piece of his in part A. Here's another one. Composers from this community, the hinterland, have been unfairly treated as simple, rustic, and unsophisticated. But this is very unfair. William Walker, for example, was self-educated, but he was educated. He read and wrote music and taught music. He wasn't someone who didn't know the musical language of his time and who was stumbling around in the dark. And as a composer, he was known to use folk music themes. William Walker was also not a fringe figure. He edited and published a very influential hymn book called Southern Harmony. And as a hymn book editor, it was William Walker who paired John Newton's text, Amazing Grace, How Sweet the Sound, with the American tune New Britain, which is the tune we all know it for. Comments I made in Part A about simplicity and simplification apply here. The simplicity of the music of this time is deceptive. It's not underdeveloped and simple. It's a deliberately minimalistic sound, exploring new methods of harmony drawn from both existing harmonic thinking and natural music, the naturally occurring harmonies from which all music is constructed. It was a serious artistic undertaking, shared by many composers before and since. The text he intended for this tune was Come Ye Sinners Poor and Needy, written by the English dissenting clergyman Joseph Hart in 1759. This tune and the other William Walker tune in Part A draw from the roots of folk music, but this is not the primeval music that just happened. This music is a new creation. It's powerfully rhythmic, passionate, and religiously urgent. Religious and spiritual music. And for the time, the mid-19th century, it's new and exciting. There were differences between these different musical sources. Hastings, to a lesser degree Mason, saw themselves as part of a wider international movement with long historical roots, but also with an interest in current musical ideas. The older Connecticut School sought to create a new American hymnody, but they also had a love for British hymnody, and their musical language came largely from the Baroque. The rich and varied hymnody of the hinterland, for which William Walker is currently our sole representative, we'll look at more tunes and composers later, defies neat categorization, but it has a lot of originality and rhythm. We'll look at other tunes from this source later. In common, they were deeply pious, upright people, like the people of their age, and creating for them a Christian musical culture. Getting back to our fable, the battle of ideas between the contending schools of Europeanists and Americanists in the Northeast. The idea that Lowell Mason, Thomas Hastings, and their supporters actively terminated the development of a true American hymnody represented by the Connecticut School is wrong on all counts. Firstly, the very suggestion that the Connecticut School only favoured American music rests on the fact that their books only contained American music, but that's because each of the composers' books mainly or entirely contained their own music, and they were Americans. And this is weakened by the fact that the texts they use are often British, such as Timothy Swan's Poland, which uses a text by Isaac Watts. Secondly, Lowell Mason, the most influential figure, did not discriminate against the earlier US composers. The hymn book we looked at contained a lot of different composers, but Supply Belcher and Daniel Reed from the Connecticut School are at least among them. Thirdly, granted, Thomas Hastings is highly critical in passing of earlier US composers as a whole, but his criticisms are directed against music and composers of all kinds. He even criticizes the music of the European Renaissance. He doesn't single out the Connecticut School. Furthermore, Hastings himself calls for composers to work towards a new style of chaste and simple hymn music, which was what everybody at this time was already trying to create. Hastings' main attack, if it is an attack, is that he doesn't like polyphony or imitation, rounds, fugues, and so on, by either American or European composers. And regarding Lowell Mason, condemnation of this noble man is unjust. His main aim is education, which he does gloriously, and this aim was shared by all the composers and publishers at this time, including the Connecticut School. They were all trying to improve music education, which they did together very successfully. And also about Lowell Mason, we just looked at one tune, but we'll look at him later in more detail. Over time, in the mid-19th century, his style changes. It's less true that he changed the direction of US hymnody than that ideas in US hymnody changed him. Also, you can hardly blame Lowell Mason for wanting to introduce European music to American choirs, as the music in question is a large portion of the most beautiful music ever written, and the ideas behind it are profound. Besides which, emotionally rich, simple, beautiful music, often based on local musical styles such as folk music, was exactly what was happening in Europe at this time. So the ideas in European Romanticism, the musical style in Europe at this time, were in accord with those trying to develop an American hymn style. And the two most important points. The Connecticut School were early composers in an extremely dynamic era. But in the US context, they were writing at the beginning of a long period of great musical innovation and creativity. Much wonderful and original music was being written. So their admirers could hardly expect the compositions of a handful of composers among a great many to be received as the sole or most important source of American hymnody. I'm sure Timothy Swan and the others were not so vain themselves as to imagine that. Their music was still sung and published in hymn books during the 19th century, and if we want beautiful music to live on, we have to sing it. It's not right to blame a few hymn book publishers and educators of the early 19th century for our own failures. Much of the music of this time should be played and sung again. And finally, a genuinely American music that reflected the musical aims of all the hymn composers of this time, of which the Connecticut School was among numerous influences, did indeed arise, and, as we will see, became perhaps the most influential musical genre that has ever existed. Sweet hour of prayer, sweet hour of prayer that calls me from a world of care and bids me at my Saviour's throne make all my wants and wishes known. In seasons of distress and grief, my soul has often found relief, and oft escaped the tender snare by thy return, sweet hour of prayer. Sweet hour of prayer, sweet hour of prayer, the joys I feel, the bliss I share, and those whose anxious spirits bow with strong desires for thy return. With such I hasten